Hi, it's Doug. This looks like just a hole in a tree trunk, right? But watch carefully. You see that there? Inside that tree trunk is a bear waking up from its winter hibernation. This is video taken from cameras set up last spring by park rangers at Glacier National Park in Montana. Now, I would have assumed that when a bear wakes up from hibernation, it just wakes up and walks off. Nope. Turns out they're really groggy. It takes them a while to feel totally awake. You can see this one just doesn't look ready. Apparently, it can take a bear a few weeks to fully wake up from its winter hibernation. Someone named Anthony has a question about hibernation. Let's give them a call now.
Hi, Doug.
Hi, Anthony.
I have a question for you. Why do bears hibernate?
Ooh, that's a great question. In books and stories, you might have heard about bears that live in cold, snowy places, sleeping through the entire winter. The idea of hibernating is kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, people living in cold, snowy places don't hibernate. And there are plenty of animals that are out during wintertime too. They don't seem to hibernate. You can still see birds, sometimes squirrels, deer. So why is that? Why do bears hibernate in the winter, but these other animals don't? Before I say anything more, what ideas do you have?
Okay, so what are your ideas about this? Why do you think bears hibernate in the winter?
Have a look at these animals that don't hibernate in winter and pay attention to the kinds of things they eat, like this cardinal or this squirrel. You see that? Notice that they're eating things like seeds and nuts, either that they've stored up from earlier in the year or that people have put in feeders for them. In wintertime, there's definitely not as much food around for these animals as there would be in summertime. But there's still enough things like seeds and nuts that are around, or in the case of deer, enough twigs, stems, and dried grasses for them to keep their bodies going through the winter. Now, let's have a look at bears. No, not when they're hibernating, but earlier in the year to see what they eat. Things like grass, insect larvae, delicious, fish, berries. Many of the foods that bears eat aren't foods that are available anymore once it gets to be cold and snowy in wintertime. Some bears do eat acorns and hazelnuts, which are available in winter, but there's just not enough of these around to keep an entire bear fed through the winter. And it's not just bears that hibernate too. Other animals that depend on foods that aren't available in wintertime also tend to hibernate. Animals like skunks, they hibernate. And groundhogs, they normally eat grass, which isn't available in winter. Bats hibernate too. These are just a few examples of animals other than bears that also hibernate in winter. So hibernation seems to be a way that some animals deal with there being not enough of their food available in the wintertime. But how exactly does this work? Like, are animals that are hibernating really asleep all winter? I mean, it's one thing to sleep in for a couple of hours one day, but imagine to sleep for weeks or months? Don't they get hungry? Well, hibernation seems to work a little different depending on the animal. But scientists have found out that in general, hibernation isn't exactly the same thing as sleep. In fact, it can be helpful to think of hibernation less like sleep and more like an animal being able to put its body on pause, like a pause button. Animals that go into hibernation in winter have bodies that are able to slow down. Their heartbeat slows down. Their breathing slows down. Their bodies wind up needing less of everything than they would normally need. Less oxygen, less water, less food. How do their bodies do this? Well, so far, most of this is still a mystery. We're only just beginning to figure some of it out. There's lots we don't yet understand. But keep in mind, even though a bear hibernating is a bit like putting its body on pause, it doesn't mean a bear's body stops completely. Its body still has needs. It may not need to eat while it hibernates, but its body still uses nutrients stored up from before it went into hibernation. Scientists think this is probably why bears eat as much as they can and get so big in late summer and fall before winter comes. A lot of scientists find the idea of hibernation super interesting and important, not just because it's fun to know, but because think about it. Just imagine if we could figure out how to put our own bodies on pause. That would give us the ability to pause someone who's sick or injured and get them to the doctor in time. Or maybe even the ability to one day pause ourselves, wait a few hundred years, and get unpaused, having traveled through time. So, in summary, bears hibernate as a way to deal with not having enough food in winter. Hibernation looks like sleeping, but in some ways, it's more like an animal being able to put its body on pause. That's all for this week's question. Thanks, Anthony, for asking it.
All right. So the question for today's mystery was, why do bears hibernate? So the first question to discuss or write down is, why do bears hibernate? The second question is, what types of food do bears eat? Doug talked about specifically why bears hibernate in the winter, and that's part of the reason why they eat certain foods. So what are those certain foods that bears eat? And then the last question is, what are some other types of animals that hibernate? Bears are not the only animals that hibernate. And he talked about some of those other animals, so name and discuss some of the other animals that hibernate. And I will see you for the next mystery.